Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and happy Women's History Month. What better way to start off the celebration? My name's Coretta Harris, and I'm president of Women in Philanthropy at UCLA, and I'd like to welcome you to our Stories of Success series, an opportunity for alumna, graduate students, and Women in Philanthropy members to hear a terrific presentation and get to know and network with one another. Women in Philanthropy has held several of these Stories of Success programs over the years on a variety of topics with time for the attendees to interact. Hopefully, you've had a chance to meet some new people during the reception, and there will be more time to connect with each other during dessert after the presentation. And also, you won't have to deal with the basketball traffic. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to share a few words about Women in Philanthropy at UCLA. Women in Philanthropy celebrates and inspires women's giving across the UCLA campus and fosters women's participation on campus boards and volunteer leadership positions. Our goal is to deepen and broaden the connections women have with the university and each other. The group will celebrate its 30th anniversary in 2024. It now boasts over 3,100 members who contribute time, talent, and treasure to every corner of the university. And I'd like to thank a few of our board members, I think Aggie and Judith, who are in attendance. Didn't see anyone else. They're waving their hands. Thank you for attending. These extraordinary women leaders have roles on many of the advisory leadership groups at UCLA and also hold positions within the UCLA Foundation. To engage the UCLA community, we hold events throughout the year that showcase different areas, topics, and extraordinary individuals or alums across campus. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Melanie Ho, an amazing woman. Based on research, but told as a fast-paced novel, Beyond Learning in Gender Equity and What Organizations Are Up Against is a silver medalist in the 2022 Axiom Awards, recognizing the world's best business books. Melanie Ho's novel alternates between the perspective of male and female characters across genders, generations, and levels at a fictional workplace. Melanie is an award-winning author, speaker, and leadership consultant who has worked with Fortune 500 organizations, startups, leading universities, nonprofits, and government groups. A triple alumna from UCLA with a BA in 2001, Master's in English in 2005, PhD in English in 2008. Melanie also blends 20 years of expertise in the leadership of complex organizations with her perspective as an artist and multimedia storyteller. Her unique keynotes and workshops start with today's most important leadership concepts and then come alive through the power of the imaginative arts. She will share new insights about why gender gaps are so hard to close despite our best intentions. Today's presentation should be very enlightening and informative. And with that, I'd like to introduce Melanie Ho.
Thank you, Coretta, and thank you to Women in Philanthropy, Melissa and Betty, for your hard work in putting together this event and all the wonderful food. I can't think of a place I'd rather be to kick off Women's History Month. It is such an honor to be here with all of you. I feel the energy in the room already. I can't wait to talk to all of you over dessert. Oh. Well, My job is one I never thought I'd have. When I was in graduate school, I used to say that I wanted to someday have a job that I don't know exists. And what I do today is draw comics about bias in the workplace and bring those comics to employers, to different kinds of organizations, to get people to lower their defenses on these difficult topics. I love getting executives to draw. Have people come in, their guards are up, their shoulders are tight. What, you're gonna make me draw? And by the end of the workshop, they're showing off their stick figures. Not just because they had the fun of playing, but because those stick figures help them reflect on really important topics related to organizational culture. So how did I get here? We'll do 4 things today. First, give you a little sense of my journey. How did I get to this point of drawing comics about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in the workplace? Then I'll show you some of I'll have them fan favorite comics, the ones where a lot of women will pull me aside or they'll send me a LinkedIn message and they'll say, I didn't want my boss to see me commenting on your comic, but that happened to me. Or I'm so glad that we can talk about this, that we can have more, think of it as real talk about some of these challenges. Then we'll talk about, how can we use art? How can we have the right kinds of conversations in our workplaces to create systemic and cultural change? I'll give you a little bit of a taste of the kinds of conversations I've been having across the country, across industries, with different folks who truly are trying to change their workplaces for the better. And then finally, I can't wait to continue the conversation, beginning with some time for Q&A here, but out into the reception and after that as well. So here's a little bit of the story behind the story. Why did I write a book called Beyond Leaning In? Now it's funny because I think people are always looking for conflict, right? I'll have a lot of people, and I'll say 90% of the time this is men, who will come up to me and say, were you trying to fight back against Sheryl Sandberg, that Facebook lady? No, it's called Beyond Leaning In, not against leaning in. When Lean In came out in 2013, I was at first really excited. I had listened to her TED Talk that came out a few years before that so many times. She had this wonderful TED Talk, I'm sure a lot of us have seen it, where she talks about how women need to take our seats at the table, raise our hands. It was so empowering. I had friends, we would listen to it before we were about to ask for a raise or a promotion we deserved. It was like this powerful rallying cry. And then Lean In came out, 2013. It was the same year I was promoted at work. This really is kind of ridiculous. I went from managing 4 people to 40 to 70 within a few months. And it was this crash course. I was reading every single thing I could about leadership, management, wrapping my mind around this role I had and all these people I felt responsible for. I was also noticing the extent to which men and women were talked about differently in the workplace. Because before that, I knew my experience. I knew that of my close friends. But now I had all these data points. I had all these folks. We were sitting in our performance review conversations or hallway conversations, and I would hear, oh, right, maybe we're talking about how Chad is great with data, and Haley's great with data too, but instead we're talking about her infectious smile. She's the glue of the office. So often I was seeing this happening in a workplace where actually people really wanted to do good. I started wondering, well, the challenge here is that Lean In came out at that exact moment. And so I thought, okay, finally we're going to talk about these issues. Sheryl Sandberg says in the book, she's not trying to solve everything related to gender equity. This is one book. She is covering one slice of it. But corporate America, and when I say corporate America, I just mean employers. Because corporate America's cultures, that is everywhere. I've spent much of my career as a consultant to college and university leaders. I've worked with folks in healthcare, nonprofit. When I say corporate America, I mean all employers. Corporate America likes sound bites. It likes easy solutions that are fast, right? Those quick wins. And Lean In provided just that. It was literally 2 words, right? It's not just something that could fit on one PowerPoint slide. It could fit on one bullet. And so whenever anything came up related to gender at work, the answer was just lean in. Okay, there's this challenge. Well, let's give the woman an assertiveness training. I thought, wow, there's just so much that's missing. It's not about Lean In the book, it's about how it got weaponized against women by saying everything is our fault. We're not going to look at the system, we're going to look at the woman. I started becoming a little bit obsessive. I just read everything I could find to understand, okay, what's the counterpoint to this? What are all of the other issues at play? There's so much great research out there. I started just interviewing. It ended up being hundreds of women. If you were sitting next to me on a plane, if we happened to meet at a barbecue, I just want to know your story. And I found that the things I was noticing in my workplace were true everywhere. Didn't matter the industry, didn't matter the size of the organization. There were these same challenges, and they were all backed up by piles of research. And yet, a lot of that wasn't getting talked about. I started to realize how much of this real talk was just happening behind closed doors. And that created two challenges. One, it meant that a lot of women were experiencing bias every single day and didn't really know it, couldn't admit it to themselves. Is this me? Is this bias? Well, I don't want to have to think about it. I don't have the language for it. And so they were internalizing the bias. They were thinking it was their fault. It also meant that many of the men I talked to who really wanted to help, they didn't have the vocabulary or understanding either. All they heard was lean in. And so anytime they were trying to be good allies, they would say, okay, let me help my women on my team become more confident. Because that real talk was behind closed doors, we couldn't have the conversations we needed to have. I started to wonder, well, why isn't there real talk? And I realized that a lot of it is because gender equity, any kind of ism, these are not neutral topics. They are emotionally charged ones, and we are not good as a society at dealing with emotions, but especially in the workplace. I often ask folks when I'm about to enter a diversity, equity, and inclusion training, when you hear that there's going to be a DEI training in your workplace, what are the emotions that you think people feel as they're coming in? It's such a mix of emotions. There's fear, there's angst, there's sometimes skepticism, either because someone doesn't believe in it or because they do, and they've been to so many trainings and they haven't worked out. There's also optimism and curiosity and excitement, but it's just this mix of so many emotions. I think of it as like this emotion soup. Now, what happens when there's emotion soup is that we have our guards up. That means that we go into a typical diversity, equity, and inclusion training in any workplace or community organization. So many of us have our guards up, whether or not we fully even realize the extent to which we have our guards up. And that means a few things. One, that it's really hard to have that real talk, to have that honest conversation. And second, it's actually also really hard to come up with creative solutions because we're a little bit frozen. I started to just think about, okay, I have been reading so much, and I want everyone to read what I'm reading, but at the end of a workday, we're all tired. How many people are going to read all of that literature? And so a question I had was, okay, well, how do we start to get this conversation going? How do we expose more people to this robust amount of research that has nothing to do with just leaning in and women being more confident? And I took inspiration from a few different places. One was an author named Patrick Lencioni. A lot of folks read him in business school. I got a PhD in English, so I had never heard of him. But all my friends who went to business school or who did Teach for America, so many folks said, hey, you probably like these books. He's a business author who writes business fables. They are business books based on important concepts he uses as a consultant, but they're told as novels. And I thought, wow, this is interesting, because one thing I noticed was that some of my coworkers, folks who I think of as folks who don't really read a lot, I had this boss, for example, he never read a business book. He would often say, well, I read the Harvard Business Review article and that wasn't enough. And I would think, wow, you are missing so much. And he also didn't read novels. Sort of, I'm too serious for a fiction kind of guy. And yet, he devoured Pat Lencioni's books. He just loved following the stories in this of these fictional CEOs and what they were dealing with. I also came across, in my day job, I was working at a consulting technology firm that was primarily serving college and university leaders. And I was working with college and university presidents across the country. And a lot of them were saying to me, you know, we're trying to get our university to move in entirely new directions, but it's so hard because folks are so attached to how the college used to be. These aren't places like UCLA that have more applicants than anywhere else in the country. These are colleges that actually might go out of business. And I started to realize how much that emotion soup was happening in those boardrooms, because I would go on campus, I would present reams of data, what was going on with demographics and higher ed finances and all these reasons why some of these colleges need to just radically change their strategy. And everyone would nod their heads and agree with the data. These are some of the smartest people in the room. But then as soon as we had to actually decide what to do next and really change what higher ed might mean on their campus, they froze. And those defensive shoulders went up, and we couldn't actually have real conversation. I started to just wonder, okay, well, how do other industries, how do companies deal with this when they're trying to make changes and change is hard? And I came across this wonderful book called Leading Transformation. It tells the story of Lowe's, the hardware store, not the hotel chain, and about how Lowe's was facing a situation where they were dealing with store closings and layoffs. They were running hard to stay in second place to Home Depot. And if you had asked any member of the Lowe's leadership team why was this, they would have said, you know, we're really good at seeing incrementalism, what's right in front of us, what is here rather than what's possible, and we need to change that. They did a really bold thing. They hired 5 science fiction writers. They gave them all of their market research data, customer data, technology data, all of those trends, and said, come up with some stories about the future of Lowe's. They then took those stories and they gave them to a comic book artist. And the comic book artist drew a comic about a young couple who loved this aging home that they had just bought. They loved its history, but they couldn't imagine how to renovate it. They wanted to, but they just didn't know how to communicate. Their contractor got really frustrated. So in this comic, they go to Lowe's, they put on the AR glasses, they can suddenly see what their home should look like, and of course they buy stuff at Lowe's. And the book talks about how this really was responsible for this gigantic turnaround at Lowe's, where within a few years they were profiled, Fast Company, Forbes, Inc. Everybody was talking about Lowe's as having these innovative partnerships with Google, as having retail robots that stocked inventory at night and could greet customers in the day. They were this hotbed of experimentation, all because they realized that what they needed to get people out of being stuck, to get people out of emotion soup, was the power of stories, of fiction, of comics. I ended up returning to research I didn't think I would end up ever returning to. This is me during graduate school in the English department here, where I wrote a dissertation called Useful Fiction. And it was inspired by work I'd actually started doing here as an undergraduate. I was fortunate to be able to design my own major through the college honors program. My major was called Policy and Media Studies. And honestly, I named it that to sound marketable. But really what it was a combination of literature, film, communications, news media, advertising, and what are the different ways that messages can come across through these mediums for public policy, for ideology change. I went and ended up deciding to focus really on the novel as a PhD student and looked at the novel as a kind of self-help, the novel as a kind of education, especially in the early 20th century. And I didn't really think I would come back to that. But as I started to see all these forms of useful fiction, having a dissertation called Useful Fiction suddenly became relevant. And I started going through a lot of my research from them and thinking, okay, if I were to write a business book as a novel that would make a change related to thinking about gender equity in the workplace, how would I do it? Beyond leaning in, there's lots of footnotes for people who want to get deep in the research, but essentially it is a story of a number of folks at an organization, at a tech company, it could be any company, it happens to be a tech company, where everybody wants to solve gender gaps, but it's not happening. And we look at why. It tells the story to begin with the CEO. Her name is Deborah. She's a baby boomer. She has smashed all those glass ceilings. She has fought so hard for women on her team. She has been a mentor to women. And yet at the beginning of the book, she's trying to figure out the millennial, the Xennial woman. I don't know if Xennial is the right way to pronounce that, X-E-N-N-I-A-L. That's the fusion of Gen X and millennial. That's what I am, and yet I don't know how to pronounce it. Xennial, is it X-Xennial? Anyway, Deborah is trying to figure out why these leaders are departing at higher rates than men and why they're less engaged on engagement surveys. And it's a little bit of a mystery story. She ends up getting reverse mentored by one of her younger employees, a woman named Cassandra. And through their perspectives, as well as the perspectives of other men, of other women and men and folks at all levels of the organization chart, we just start to see just all of these systemic factors. And my hope was that by using a fictional story, it would help readers lower their guards a bit, that it kind of depersonalizes a lot of the things that can feel really emotional, but it also allows us to develop empathy for characters unlike them. I also thought that I wanted to be able to show the difference between intent versus impact. That's a commonly used phrase we'll talk a little bit more about in diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions, but it came about for me, what I noticed was that a lot of times at my company, we would have these diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, and I would look around me, and we would be reading these case studies of really horrible bias in the workplace. And everybody would say, wow, this is terrible, this shouldn't be happening. And then someone would raise their hand, and they would say, but we don't know the full story of the person who said they did this bias thing. I mean, they didn't mean it. I mean, maybe they're a really good person. Why are we talking about this? Because they're probably a good person. One of the most important themes we'll talk about is intent versus impact, and that's what I hope to show through a book as a novel, is that every single character there are no villains here. They are all people who want to do the right thing, who care deeply about gender equity, and yet things are going wrong, and we can look at why once we separate out, did they mean it or not? Are they a good person or not? I also hope to show the cumulative effect of day-to-day challenges. I think the other thing I noticed often was that the word microaggressions would also cause people to shut down, because they would say, well, if it's micro, why does it matter? When you see a group of sympathetic characters who thing after thing after thing keeps happening to them, it helps us see that, oh, actually these little things do add up. At one point, I thought about calling the book 1,000 Everyday Cuts. This is me at the end of 2021. I was one of those people who did the Great Resignation thing early in the pandemic. Left my job at the end of 2020 because I thought, there's something here when it comes to the power of the arts for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I'm not going to be able to focus on it with a full-time job, so we'll figure it out. What's my plan? I'm going to show you now some of the comics again that I often hear just the most discussion about. This one, so many women will say to me, I actually heard that phrase bet with happen so often in a lot of our discussions of employees at my firm that I would just take notes every time, a tally, whenever we discussed employees, the times I heard bet with. These are two characters in my book, Chad and Haley. On the left side, we see Chad is inexperienced, but he did a great job on that project. Let's bet with and promote him. Compared to Haley did a great job on that project, but she's inexperienced. We'll have to see more. In both cases, same thing. They're both inexperienced. They both did a great job on one project. There's a lot of robust research on this phenomenon called the prove it again phenomenon. In both cases, there's a but. In Chad's case, that but is why we will promote him. In Haley's case, that but is why she has to keep waiting. There's a lot of discussion about equal pay. There is so much less discussion about equal penalty, which I think is just as important. In this comic, I wanted to picture two staff who hear about a new policy they dislike. Shannon complains in a brusque tone, Dan slams his laptop shut and storms out of the room. I have seen this happen many times. So many women have said to me, I know a Dan, I know a Shannon, or they are Shannon. Both of them probably didn't behave that well. They were kind of rude to somebody who was just doing their job and introducing a policy. But what happens later that day? The discussion about Shannon among leaders, Shannon can't control her temper. It'll really limit her career. Dan can't control his temper, but he's a good guy. Nobody's perfect. Now, people talk about the Dans of this world as, hey, you know, you want him on your team because he'd be really good like in a beer brawl, as if that happened every day, as if that had anything to do with the workplace. I could have drawn 10 comics about the fatherhood bonus versus the motherhood penalty. In the top left, I wanted to show this dude who's speaking in front of a room, and he says, hey everyone, I'm a little tired today. I have a 5-month-old at home. You can hear the collective, ah, what a good dad. He's talking about his kid. Now, what's the audience thinking? And I think it's important to show there are both men and women in the audience here because we are all subject to the same unconscious biases. They're thinking, with a new baby, he'll likely stay here a while, a good candidate for that big project. That's that fatherhood bonus. They might even be thinking, maybe we should pay him more. He's such an involved dad. He took yesterday to go to the PTA meeting. Now for the mother, heard she just had a new baby, she might scale back. Not good for that big project. Should we promote her? Below that, she missed the PTA meeting yesterday. She's clearly overcommitted. Now, I'll tell you, I went back and forth. I couldn't decide, did she go to the PTA meeting and she's overcommitted? Did she miss the PTA meeting? She's overcommitted. It doesn't matter. I could have drawn it either way. Either way, she is judged in a way that the father next to her is not. Why is it so hard for those who experience workplace bias to speak up? This is one I actually drew more recently because after taking these comics on the road and talking to so many folks, sometimes I would hear, usually men, come up to me after, or I'd hear them saying something to one another, and they would say, well, you know, why aren't the women speaking up? If it's this bad, why aren't they saying something? If it's this bad in my industry, that's not tech, that's not whatever they think bad industries are, why aren't the women saying something? Well, what happens when women who experience workplace bias do speak up? People think, she's so difficult, so much drama. Now, if she's a black woman, she needs to be less angry. Why is she being so aggressive? If she's an Asian woman, maybe there's a dragon lady stereotype, or maybe she's usually so submissive. Did she just not get the joke this time, or ever? At the bottom, if she is a recent immigrant, maybe folks are thinking she should just feel lucky to be here. And the important thing when it comes to understanding intersectionality, the intersecting identities that many of us have, is that it's not just two different identities. There's kind of a compounding effect. 1 + 1 = 3 in this case. And so these women have so many reasons not to speak up. This is part of why all of these conversations happen behind closed doors. And what happens when women do try to speak up, when women are good allies to one another? This is research in the Harvard Business Review on diversity valuing behaviors and how women and people of color are penalized when they show and behave in a way that values diversity and allyship, whereas white men are more likely given positive points for it. At the top, I wanted to show how these two exact leaders get perceived very differently for the same thing. At the top, 2 colleagues point out that parental status shouldn't be part of hiring decisions. On the left, she always makes everything about gender. Why isn't she just doing her job? On the right, he's such a great ally and inclusive leader. On the bottom, 2 leaders sign up to be mentors in a program supporting women of color. On the left, she spends too much time on service instead of her real job, even though she's also expected to do all of the service. On the right, he's such a great ally and inclusive leader. Now, one of the questions I get asked is, will Gen Z save us all? Unfortunately, not yet. Now, I do think that things are getting better. I don't want to sound all negative. Certainly things are getting better, and yet at the same, we're even having more conversations like this one. And yet at the same time, our biases run so deep. This was an experience that a friend told me about recently. She was at the playground, and she was watching a kid's tennis class there. She noticed at the end of the kids' class, the teacher said to all the kids, if you clean up the balls, you'll get a snack. The girls cleaned up. The boys goofed off, with the coach, by the way. The parents all laughed. Girls are so organized, boys will be boys, and everybody gets the snack. Now, what my friend said disturbed her most about this was that these are millennial parents who know better, who have read all the research about gender bias. She said, you know, we're in Washington, D.C. People wear their wokeness as a badge. And they know not to do this. They know about gender norms, and they talk about wanting to break them. And these are Gen Z kids who are the ones that we hope will behave in very different ways. And yet this is still going on. Now, how does this fast forward into the workplace, at home, where women continue to do, one of the great phrases I heard recently was responsibility magnet, right? Taking on more and more without credit, without authority, without reward, taking on more mental load, taking on more emotional labor. It's just expected. That's why a single closed door can mean different things depending on whose name is on the door. On the left side, we have a door of Jen. On the right side is Tim. On the left side, the audience, or just folks in that office, they're thinking things like, Jen's door is always closed. She is so inaccessible. She thinks she's so important. Tim has that same closed door. He's really busy and important, so of course his door is never open. We just expect that women are accessible in a different way. At the bottom, let's say that Jen and Tim both are able to take 5 minutes of a day to help a colleague in need, a junior person in need. On the left side, Jen was only able to help me for 5 minutes. She must be in over her head with her job. If she can't help, there must be a reason why, and it gets to her competence. Now, Tim, he also only takes 5 minutes. He was so generous to help me for that 5 minutes when he's got so much to do. He's not expected to help. This is the office of equivalent of it being called babysitting when fathers watch their kids, right? In the office, it's that generosity for being supportive that women are just expected to do all the time. Now, why does this happen? I have a bunch of comics on the mental autocompletes, but they are so small that they were harder to show, so you can find them on my website. I started using the phrase mental autocomplete instead of unconscious bias because I realized that people have a bias against the term bias, and we kind of shut down when we hear it. To me, unconscious bias is just like autocompletes, and it was something that really struck me when the iPhone rolled out those autocomplete emojis, right? When you type in happy birthday and it just gives you a balloon to put in. And I realized that when I typed in CEO, it gave me a man all the time, no other options. And if I typed in doctor, it also gave a man emoji, no other options. I mean, these are emojis. Why are the emojis biased, right? And of course, it's the iPhone's programming. The iPhone was programmed to be biased. Now, sometimes autocompletes are good things, right? They help us get things done faster. When we're text messaging, I love those autocompletes sometimes. I love those autocompletes on Google Docs or Microsoft Word or Outlook that finish my sentence for me. Autocompletes aren't entirely bad, but sometimes autocompletes are pernicious and really, really wrong. And unfortunately, they're much harder to reprogram when it's a person than when it's a phone. But if we start to think of autocompletes, then we can realize that we all have them, and everyone around us has them. It's not that folks are intending to be biased. It's that these autocompletes are deeply wired, and what we can do knowing that is figure out how to stop them in their tracks. These are just a few of the comics that people have drawn in some of my workshops with employers around the country. My inspiration for having people draw, I mentioned earlier, leading transformation about the story of Lowe's. Another inspiration of mine is Linda Berry. She is a MacArthur Fellow. She is a UW-Madison professor. I had the good fortune to be able to take a workshop with her just before the pandemic started. And Linda Berry talks about drawing as a form of expression and a form of thinking. And it's actually about putting your mind in a different place, not to put something in an art gallery. Linda talks a lot about how when we're kids, we all draw. And if you talk to a small child, they'll say even sometimes that they're drawing their letters because they don't see a distinction between drawing and writing. Now, at some point, that sense of, well, drawing and writing are both forms of expression, at some point, they decide they can't draw. Now, maybe a teacher said it to them, maybe they just compared their drawing to someone else's who they thought was better, but we start to think of drawing as something that is meant for artists, for people who are going to frame something, not drawing as something that can just be a tool that helps us all. I'm gonna compare it to writing. Because with writing, we know that we write sometimes for formal reasons. I want to write a report, an article, a book, a memo, a proposal for a client. And we write for informal reasons. We doodle on cocktail napkins. We just write down our ideas. We jot down thoughts on our iPhone when we come up with something. Writing has different purposes. It can be formal. It can be to help us process and think. Drawing can be the exact same way. We can draw for art. We can draw to think. The comics I have people draw are the next few frames of this comic. I call it the Cupcake Trap. And part of that was because one of the odd things as I was interviewing women and writing Beyond Leading In, the number of times that baking came up was extraordinary. So many women talked about, do I bake at work? Do I not bake at work? I'll tell you what I did, which is I baked a lot in the early years. I got to a point where I realized I should stop baking to be taken seriously. Then I became a vice president. I started baking again because at that point I figured they couldn't do anything to me. But so many women just face these conflicts. Okay, I have this newer colleague and she's baking so much. People are only identifying her with baking. Should I tell her to stop? Should I not tell her to stop? On the left side, this is a promotion memo. And it's congratulating Mike and Mara for their promotions to analytics manager. Now, Mike, it says, led the analysis for a project that led to $5 million in revenues. Mara, promoted to the exact same position of analytics manager, she has great work ethic and great baking skills. All of us have gained a few pounds from her cupcakes. Now, this happens on formal things like promotion memos. It also happens when we're just introducing colleagues for the first time at a conference, in the hallway, when we're talking about our colleagues in the at the water cooler. So often, women are described by these, how they contribute to the community, or so-called soft skills. Men are described by the things that get people to continue to be promoted, that get them to be seen as executive material. At the bottom, I wanted to show this guy. He's saying, what's the big deal? They both got promoted. I drew a guy here. I could have drawn anyone. I've had this thought myself, too. I've had this thought where I've seen something, hey, this is gendered language. Okay, am I going to address this? Should I address this? Is it worth it to address it? And I've talked myself out of it. I've talked myself out of it because I thought, they both got promoted. On the right side of this comic, I want to show why I was wrong, why it does matter. And this is just one example. These two individuals are talking. One of them says, I'm looking for project help. What do you know about Mike or Mara? His colleague says, I heard Mike is great. I don't know much about Mara. Now, this could be 2 weeks later. This could be 3 months later. This could be a year later. They exhibit no bias towards Mike or Mara individually. They have never met them. But because of this memo, because of the hundreds of conversations where women and men are described differently in the hallways, at the water cooler, in our Slack channels, in our emails, as we're introducing people, people remember Mike for the revenues and Mara for the cupcakes. This is the importance of intent versus impact. Nobody, whoever wrote the memo, they just wanted to celebrate them. Nobody wanted bad things to happen. But there is a negative impact, and I'll go through a few more slides and then take questions. There's a negative impact on Mara, potentially, how she feels about her job. She brought in $10 million in revenues, maybe. Why isn't that being recognized? There's also one on the organization. That's one thing I have folks brainstorm is, okay, let's think of all the potential characters at this organization and how actually this one memo could hurt the organization. Maybe Mara isn't picked for an assignment that she needs to be. Maybe there's younger employees who come in and they think, well, I need to start baking, otherwise I won't get promoted, and they start learning how to bake instead of making pivot tables. How do we stop this from happening? This is just an example. What I like to do with teams is just have them start to brainstorm all the reasons why this happens and how to stop it. What you find is really interesting because people always think that solving DEI from a systemic and cultural perspective is hard. That's why so many organizations just have one-off trainings, because systems seem too complicated. It's actually not that complicated. If we just look at this one memo, we can see all of the reasons where we could intervene, and if you put them together, that's a system. The sending of the memo itself. Okay, whoever hit send on that memo, maybe they needed a bias check, maybe they needed a Mad Libs template. Don't include personal things unless you do for everybody, and that gets a little bit tricky, so yeah, maybe we need several folks checking this memo. The contributions of the paragraphs to the memo by Mike's and Mara's managers, maybe they needed a template. Now, maybe recency bias was the problem. Maybe Mike brought in $5 million in revenues yesterday, and Mara brought in $10 million 5 months ago, and her manager's turned over, or her manager doesn't remember. So maybe we need a way to help managers keep track of employee accomplishments across the year. Self-advocacy tools for employees. I'm always a little hesitant to mention this one because this is basically lean in, but still important. Maybe Mike was taught how to advocate for himself and Mara wasn't. Mara was actually taught to be humble instead. Informal and formal structures for colleagues to learn about each other's skills. Maybe folks just know more about Mike because some of the leaders of the company think that Mike reminds them of a younger version of themselves. They invite him to golf. They hear about his revenue contributions that way. They never hear about Mara's. How do we make sure that everybody has that kind of airtime and access? And finally, how do we craft systems to distribute responsibilities for white space activities? White space meaning the things that have no formal ownership. Mara maybe bakes cupcakes because she realizes that when they have tense meetings, cupcakes can diffuse that tension. Everybody's happier, more productive, and it's collaborative, and that's great. Mike was never socialized to think that way. His sister made all the cupcakes in his household. Maybe we just need to alternate who brings the snacks to meetings. And finally, and I want to make sure to get to questions, but when we think about this as a set of systemic issues, and metaphor that I love is this one from David Foster Wallace, the novelist. He has a great commencement speech where he talks about how this older fish is swimming by some younger fish, and the older fish says to the younger fish, "How's the water?" And the younger fish swim a little bit for a while before one of them says, "What the hell is water? We don't know we're swimming in water." David Foster Wallace says that this fish story shows how the most obvious, important realities are the ones that are hardest to see and talk about. And that water is our organizational culture. The water is everything that assumes as default a white man, probably also cis, straight, and non-disabled, but just a few examples. The water is like, water fountains that don't detect darker skin. That's the water. Also, lights in many hospital settings don't detect scars on darker skin. The water is the temperature of our offices that often are built around what men are comfortable in, not women. The water is also airbags that are designed around men's bodies and tested with men's bodies, not women. The water is also the many organizational norms or the way we do things that benefit some groups over others. That means that for some folks, the water is great, and for others, that water is freezing. How we measure success is just one example of that. Urgency, quick wins, right? Let's write this memo quickly instead of do it right. What can be quantified? Maybe Mara brought in 3 million in revenues, but she trained 5 people and they each brought in 5 million in revenues, but it's harder to measure that that's Mara's contribution. Activity over outcome, that's when folks value in-office time rather than what's getting done. Finally, what I think of as points versus assists. What's valued in our meeting culture? Points. My opinion is that statement worded as a pretend question. That's my favorite one. A meeting culture that's about points is where we're advancing one's own individual viewpoint and contribution. Everyone's trying to win the meeting. In assist, I know you disagree. I would like to hear your view. Hey, someone had a good idea at the last meeting. It's not about the individual. It's about advancing the organization's collective aims. We have a society that often values those points. Our organizational cultures and our meeting cultures often value those points. Women are often socialized to care more about assist. Men, boys are often socialized to care more about those points. And finally, we can get you all these slides, so don't feel the need to remember all of this. Or if you do take pictures of it, feel free to post, but you can also get those slides. I do work a lot with groups on just red flag phrases. And hey, how do we reset the conversation? Hopefully using some of the ideas from our comics. Hey, this is feeling like a points versus assists meeting. What are our mental autocompletes? Any phrases that teams can practice using to diffuse some of that tension? I want to make sure to open the floor for questions, but would love to stay in touch. Text voice to 66866 to join my email newsletter. I won't text you, it's just a way to collect your email addresses. I send an email out every 3 to 4 weeks. You can also learn how to get a free signed book plate sticker during Women's History Month, get links to all of my comics, and also find my podcast and be the first to see some upcoming new comics I'm drawing about why race is just so hard to talk about, building on that "this is water" analogy. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Natalie. Yes.
Okay, you brought up the fact that the woman was cooking cupcakes. And would you say that women need to forget those home skills, those nurturing skills that we all have and like to do because we're being criticized for that? And I bring that up in reference to the original Lean In book, which I'm sure you've read.
Yeah.
And you're aware of that Harvard study that she was in the class and they had the same scenario of a college startup, and half the class rated it as exceptional leadership, and the other half of the class said, oh no, she did a terrible job and she was a bitch and she should have been taken out of that role. The only difference in that scenario was one was a man and one was a woman. When did Lean In come out?
2013.
I don't think it's changed that much.
Yeah. No, sadly not.
So, I mean, how do we go forward?
Yeah, I think, to me, the first step is awareness. And so I think what I noticed was a lot of women coming into the workplace, not even realizing that the baking of the cupcakes would have an impact on their career, not even realizing how they would be judged. And to me, it's a very personal decision how one ensures that they are their authentic selves in the workplace and showing up for their team the way they want to, but that at the same time they aren't subject to gender bias. The framework I really like is a book called Own the Room. One of the authors is Amy Sue. I'm not remembering the other author, but it talks about how every leader, every employee essentially needs to balance their voice for self and their voice for others. And I think of baking as part of that voice for others. It's because we're caring about the community. Voice for self, that gets back to those points versus assist. I think that all of us kind of have to figure out, how are we balancing the voice for self, voice for others? That's just what good leadership is, our ability to be able to be that voice for ourselves, because that can help us steer initiatives forward, but also be that voice for others. And the hard thing for us as women is that we have to navigate that with a much sort of tighter tightrope than the men do.
So when is that going to end?
It will end partly it will end when more men get involved in the conversation, unfortunately. I think that's what I'm finding in a lot of workplaces is the difference is, hey, is there a white male allies group? Some companies have them. And I hate to say we're waiting on the men, but we can't solve these problems with just women talking to one another. Yeah, sorry. Oh, you can.
Thank you very much for that. One of the things that you talked about, but not directly, was the process of ingratiation in the workplace. And this is, I believe that this has changed significantly in terms of what people are afraid to do. So one of your comments was, well, this man, we play golf with this man, whatever. My understanding, and I haven't been in a formal, larger workplace structure for a long time, is that men tell me they are afraid to say anything nice to a woman in the workplace, and they're afraid to invite them to do something because it's taken wrong. Do you have a series on that in your book?
That's a great question. I don't yet. I do have a podcast episode, and I can't remember what number it is. It's a podcast episode. I did a season of 8 podcasts, essentially, some of them including excerpts of my audiobook, and then different folks reacting to them. So there's one where I have a wife and a husband, 2 UCLA alumni, actually, who, as a married couple, they react to it, what it meant for them in their workplace, what it also means at home as they're raising their son and daughter. There's also a podcast episode where I have on it a woman who's the CEO of, she's a Gen Z woman who's the CEO of a company called Worked Up that is about helping Gen Z women in the workplace. And she tells this great anecdote about how she started her career in Hollywood post Me Too, and the real impact that had on men saying, okay, I just can't interact with women at all. I think that's really about, well, there's this great book, and I'm blanking on the title. Gail Evans is the author. And one of the things she talks about that I find interesting is that in workplaces, men often can only we all do this, everyone puts people in boxes based on kind of the heuristics they have. But that for a lot of men, especially of older generations, they are used to thinking of women as either a mother, a daughter, a wife, and they end up putting women into these categories. And they treat them, and with each one, you can kind of see the challenges of it. I think the more workplaces give opportunities for colleagues to all just get to know one another and their interests and kind of the whole person outside of golf, right? Outside of the bar, outside of all of these situations that can get kind of loaded. But hey, we have a team retreat. At the beginning of the team retreat, let's get to know our colleagues, all of our colleagues. The more we bake in things like that, the more we have environments where I think everybody feels a little bit more comfortable just getting to know each other without feeling like it has to be in some of these more loaded situations.
So when we talk about where do we go from here, what are some cures that have been put into place? Being a business owner here in California and Los Angeles, you get certified if you're a minority-owned business, which includes a woman-owned business. There's companies and agencies that have mandates to only hire a minority-owned business for a certain project. In your research and with corporations you've dealt with, are you finding that that's actually having any real impact in the success and in the balance of those businesses?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good one. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Melanie. My name is Joanne. Thank you so much for giving this presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I actually head DEI at a tech company, a hypergrowth one. And, we have a policy in place where we're an apolitical company. And I'm finding it really, really difficult to kind of talk about these types of issues without bringing divisive potentially divisive topics into the mix. And so I'm curious in sort of your journey in creating, writing your book. I need to read it. Don't worry, I ordered it. What would you recommend in navigating sort of the current landscape and, the way that politics has really divided us, but, how can we bring it back to uniting us as just humans in general?
Ooh, such a good question. One of the things I'm heartened by is that there seems to be a lot more attention to psychological safety in the workplace, and that the pandemic has led even leaders who in the past never really thought about the whole person, or who thought about emotions or the psychology of their workplace. The pandemic really changed a lot of that for a lot of people. And I think that it seems more acceptable now to discuss burnout, psychological safety. Kind of everybody's gone through this period where the phrase I'm using a lot personally is organizational renewal. Because I think almost everyone can get on board with the fact that these have been a really difficult few years. That, nothing related to diversity, equity, inclusion. These have just been a difficult few years. And we need to get to organizational renewal. And part of organizational renewal is just rethinking our norms and how people work together and how we're ensuring that our success as much as possible.
Follow up to that.
Yeah.
So would you say then, going forward, it's kind of like talking about DEI without saying it's DEI?
Yeah, and I think it's something I always have a hard time with is, when do we need to call the thing the thing? For me personally, and there are a lot of different opinions on this, for me personally, I try to use the phrases that will bring people where they need to get, taking into account where they are. And that's why I say mental autocomplete instead of unconscious bias, just because it is a way that keeps people from shutting down. That's why I talk about this is water instead of things I could say like patriarchal or supremacist structures. Most of what I say when I'm talking about the water, when I'm talking about organizational culture, when I'm talking about the automated water faucets and the airbags, that is in literature that as a person who was a humanities scholar, that's what you find in literature about supremacy culture. That's what you find in literature about misogyny. But I am not going to go into a company and start out saying, hey, we're going to talk about supremacy and misogyny today. But all of the concepts I use are from those theories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, hi. Hi, Professor. I'm a current student at UCLA, and I'm currently working on my master's thesis research on DEI in the workplace.
Oh, great.
I'm building a tech company that does basically DEI analytics and measures whether or not an organization is actually inclusive. And currently in the primary research stage, I'd love to talk to you more.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing a drop-off in the efficacy of workplace trainings for DEI, diversity workshops in general, and I'm seeing research that goes back even to the 1940s when the United States was integrating its military, right? And you had like mixed race units within that organizational structure. And I saw a pretty precipitous drop off, and you do a diversity training in an organization, some people will be receptive to it, others will be immediately defensive, and you might see a positive trend for maybe a week or two, but then it completely falls off. So how do we circumvent that failure?
Yeah, that is such a great point. I mean, so many DEI trainings backfire for all the reasons you stated. I think that one of the biggest reasons they backfire, I guess there's two. One is just this inability to deal with the elephants in the room that are the emotions. And so part of it is just giving people the vocabulary and the freedom and the permission that it's okay to feel. It's okay to feel scared in these conversations. It's okay to feel ashamed. It's okay to feel angry and frustrated and sad. And I think that if we start to normalize emotions at work, that will be one step towards better DEI conversation. And there's some great work on that. I think Google's Search Inside Yourself curriculum is great for just using mindfulness as a way to, it's kind of a backdoor way to get people to emotions. Any kind of psychological safety discussions kind of get people to emotion. There's a wonderful book by Carla McLaren called Emotions at Work. They're just sort of starting to see more discourse there. And then the second problem is that, and this gets back to this is water. Part of water, part of US organizational culture is kill the problem as quickly as possible. And so the DEI training is that check the box, okay, we're done. And so the more we start to see organizations that are saying, okay, you know, let's look at everything. Let's look at the whole system. Let's have DEI specialists on staff because this is a place where there's a body of research and best practices and we need specialists, but DEI is everybody's job. That's when we start to see more change. But I'd love to talk to you about
I
your
think we
research.
only have time for one more question. Sorry. And then we have dessert.
I know this gentleman had his hand up for a bit.
I'd like to first thank you for your remarks, and my comments are directly at the first woman. I'd like to chat with you. I'd like to chat with you for a second. I was in the Army for about 25 years, and I was in the Army for about 25 years. Institutionally, the Army is now granting women combat arms branches. Combat arms branches is a way to quick promotion to colonel or 1-star. I suspect you already know that there are women generals, 2-star and above. There are also admirals in the Navy that are both architectural and command. So that's basically a technical branch of promotion and a command branch of promotion. I'm surprised you didn't talk about that, because not only did the Army make attempts at integration early in the United States, but they've also done some things for women. The difference between women that I've promoted, been on boards with, and the women that haven't been promoted versus the men, in my view, had to do with preparation. And I must tell you that the choices that people made that weren't promoted were done by poorly qualified counselors, both men and women, poorly qualified counselors. They recommended people that should be 06s, that's full colonel, and they stopped at career majors. Why? They didn't take the right schools. They didn't take the right assignments. I think women have a lot of promise. As a matter of fact, I'm looking forward for my first 2-star woman general in the infantry.
Oh,
And
that's
she's going to
wonderful.
be hardcore.
Yeah.
I am too. I think it's a different perspective that women have, and I appreciate that. But like I said before, the lack of promotion is the unknowing of the goals of the institution. Once women get the buy-in on what they need to know and how to perform it, they do extraordinarily well, they're extraordinarily competent, and they have a long career.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of discussion we can continue to have over dessert. I think we'll take one more comment, or question.
Thank you, thank you. I was just curious as you were discussing about like these DEI people being at the organizations or at the company to ensure that it just doesn't die off with one workshop, right? And I was just curious as to whether you would also like appoint men to hold other men accountable, because I know like in the work where I work at, I'm very well, because I work with a lot of feminists and I know a lot about feminism and women's rights, and so it's often on us to hold other men accountable, because you could go to the training and then when we go to the locker room or whatever and it's just men, they're like, oh, did you hear that? That's why. So now we have to be careful what we say. They be saying this bad. I'm not trying to snitch on nobody, but I'm just saying like this is what is said after, right?
Yeah,
And so how do we hold other men accountable? Like, hey, bro, that ain't cool. Nah, you know, and I think that culture of men holding other men accountable would also be helpful, you know?
Yeah, well, join my mailing list. I have a piece on male allyship that I'll be releasing soon, and I'd love to talk over dessert. It sounds like there's just so much to keep talking about. So thank you all again. Please reach out and enjoy dessert.
I got my degree at UCLA in 1983 in mechanical engineering. So I started working as an engineer in the early 80s in a predominantly white male field at the time. I worked at the Navy in China Lake, and it was the secretary and myself, the only women. And I went in day one, a month after I graduated, and said, I don't make coffee, because I honestly didn't know how to make coffee. But I will say this, back in 1983, and I tell everybody this, I'm not making this up for tonight, that group of men, predominantly white, most of them the same age as my dad at the time, if it were not for that group that I was in, I think I would not have been an engineer for over 30 years. The Navy, the military has a lot for women. They didn't at the time, that's more stories, but now they do. So that's just my 2 cents. And the other thing I will say for everybody that's still working, because I'm retired, one of the things that helps you in this whole D&I space is having mentors. So if you don't have internal and external mentors, make sure you think about that and get you some good people within your field, in your organization, and outside of your organization. So that's just my 2 cents. So now officially, UCLA is way ahead and we won tonight. But if we haven't won, we were up by like 20 points, but you can all see that on your smartphones. But officially, thank you, Melanie. We are very grateful to Melanie for flying to LA and coming tonight to present this fascinating topic to all of us. She certainly gave us a lot to think about. It's not too late to purchase her book. It's not too late to purchase her book. It's not too late to purchase her book. A link will be included in the follow-up message from tonight's program, because you know, in the 21st century, we don't bring our books to sell them, we go online. And I'm guessing it's probably also on Amazon. Yes. Well, she'll come back. We'll just have to have her come back and sign the books. I mean, it's not like that hard. We can figure that out. We hope you'll be able to join us for our next program, our spring event, Talking Solutions, Reason to Hope for the Future of the Planet. And that's going to be a virtual Zoom program on April 27th from 5 to 6:30. So you can mark your calendar, April 27th, 5 to 6:30, it's Zoom. Talking Solutions, Reason to Hope for the Future of the Planet. Desserts now available on our buffet tables in the other section of the dining room, where we were prior to this presentation, and you're encouraged to stay and mingle with one another, and of course, talk to Melanie. And once again, thank you, Melanie, for flying out to be with us, and thank you all for coming to the program this evening.